To the 1992 book fair, and I can honestly say that it absolutely has been one of the most remarkable ones that we've had. And I thank you for it and all the volunteers for bringing it up. There's no better way to end any kind of event than with the guests that we're having tonight. And to introduce our guest, it's my pleasure to introduce someone who's been a wonderful supporter of the fair, as everyone on this campus at Miami-Dade Community College has been, and they deserve a round of applause as well. The Wolfson campus has been remarkable. Christine Evans is a professor of English at this campus, and she's also the director of the Honors Program. Please welcome Christine Evans.
Sontag is well known to you for her creativity and insight into American way of life and the contemporary world. She is the recipient of numerous prizes in the United States and internationally. She will receive a premier literary prize in Italy next week, so we are very, very honored that she could manage us in that busy schedule. Her most recent novel, which you're here, of course, already familiar with, released in September, is already a bestseller. And with no more words from me, please join me in welcoming Susan Sontag.
There's so many people who make this book fair possible, and I'm sure that there are names I should be mentioning. Forgive me if I don't out of ignorance, but I do just want to salute one person, and that's Mitchell Kaplan, who's done so much. Above and beyond anything to do with commerce, no one who runs a great bookstore is doing it for the money. It isn't something you do, first of all, to make a good living, although, of course, you hope to survive. You do it because you love books and you love literature, and you want to make this enterprise that has existed for 2,500 years continue to live a little bit longer. And I know for my book, all my books, and my latest book, of which I am particularly fond, Volcano Lover, it's people like Mitchell Kaplan who made this book live and brought it to readers. That kind of bookstore, a bookstore that's run by somebody who cares about books and chooses the books in a very selective way. The Volcano Lover is a peculiar novel. In one sense, I guess it's a historical novel. I don't want to disavow that. That is to say, it bounces off, it uses, I would say, more as a trampoline than as a scaffolding, a true story, a famous story from the past. That takes place in the late 18th century and involves some people still celebrated, known to some of you even from a famous movie from the early 40s with Vivian Leigh as Emma Hamilton and Laurence Olivier as Horatio Nelson. As I say, there is this story. There's also that Hamilton man, Sir William Hamilton, whom I call the Cavaliere, who is the British ambassador to Naples, that is to the Kingdom of the Two Sicilies. from 1764 to 1799. So the novel, insofar as it tells this story, and it does other things, it's partly written in the present. It's not a you are there historical novel. It's very much a story told with hindsight, many stories within stories, digressions, fast forwards, flash forwards, etc. Toward the end of the book, a climactic part of the book is the Neapolitan Revolution of 1799, in which the Hamiltons and Nelson played such an ignominious role. There's a lot of history in the book, and the part that I will read you, I just want to situate it in terms of time. I'll be reading you from chapter 5 of part 2, when my principal characters are in Palermo, where they've gone into exile when the French have, Napoleon's forces have taken over Naples. And the famous romance begins, or it has already begun, but in fact is consummated. I call my novel a romance, but I don't mean it's a romance because it has a romantic character or it has a love story. In fact, it has several love stories in it. I don't mean it in the Barbara Cartland sense or the Harlequin romance sense. In fact, it's thanks to having written Volcano Lover that I found out that Barbara Cartland exists, because since I only patronize stores like those run by Mitchell Kaplan, I had actually never seen a copy of a Barbara Cartland or a Harlequin novel, but I found that because I gave the subtitle romance to my book, many people thought that I meant something about romance in that sense. I did not. I was actually using the word romance in the sense that it's used by Hawthorne in the preface to The House of Seven Gables. And he says when the writer calls a novel a romance, that's because the writer is claiming a certain kind of liberty with respect to fashion or materials that might not otherwise be claimed. We're going to call it a novel. It, of course, is a novel. It's a novel indeed, I think, although its characters are European. It's a very American novel that is in the tradition of writers like Hawthorne, who wrote several novels that took place in Italy. This is from chapter 5 of part 2 of the Volcano Lover. At first he had pretended not to notice her staring, then stared back too. Stares like long, deep respirations passed between them. Their readiness to give themselves to strong emotions, which makes them different from the Cavalieri and so like each other, didn't mean they understood what they were feeling or what they should do about it. The Cavalieri, who had not known passion until he met the young woman he had made his second wife, had been quick to acknowledge what he felt. But then, the Cavalieri was not interested in being understood. The hero wants to be understood, which means, for him, being praised and sympathized with and encouraged. And the hero is a romantic. That is, his vanity was matched by an inordinate capacity for humility when his affections were engaged. He felt so honored by the Cavalieri's friendship, by the friendship, and then the love, he dared call it love, of his wife. If I am loved by people of this quality, then I know I am worthwhile. He is infatuated with them both and reluctant to think beyond his immediate feelings of elation in their company. The Cavalieri's wife knows what she feels, but for the first time in her life doesn't know what to do about it. She can't help flirting. It's as much a part of her nature as her gift from monogamy. Loyalty is one of the virtues she practices most effortlessly. Not that she is averse to effort, she too had a heroic temperament. Neither wants to offend, humiliate, or hurt the Cavalieri. Both hesitate to injure their most cherished ideas of themselves. The hero is a man of honor. The Cavalieri's wife is a reformed courtesan whose genuine devotion and serene fidelity to her husband attested to her having entirely left behind her old identity. The hero wanted to continue to be what he had always been. She wanted to continue to be what she so spectacularly had become. Everyone assumed they were lovers. In fact, they had not even yet kissed. As if by mutual accord, they tried to exhaust their passion for each other through quite public and entirely sincere expressions of mutual adulation. On one occasion, a party for the Russian ambassador, she leaned over and kissed his medals. He did not blush. And he recounted to every new guest the stories of her heroic deeds, which the others had already heard. All that she had done for him, for the British cause, her courage during the stormy passage from Naples. She never went to bed during the whole trip, and her selfless attendance on the royal couple. She became their slave, he said. And pronouncing the word slave thrilled him in a way he did not understand. He repeated it again. She became their slave. Saint Emma, he called her sometimes, with the most earnest expression on his face, the pattern of perfection. He wanted to admire himself, but he was even quicker to admire anyone he loved. He admired his father. He had admired Fanny. That was Nelson's wife happening. He admired his father. He had admired Fanny. He admired the Cavalieri, and now he admired the woman who was the Cavalieri's wife. To say that he loved her more than he had loved anyone in his life is to say that he admired her more than anyone. She was his religion, Saint Emma. No one dared smile. But the refugees were becoming restless. Gratitude to the hero who had shepherded their flight to Palermo had been replaced by grumbling. They were stranded. He seemed becalmed. Wasn't it time for him to rejoin the British fleet in the Mediterranean and win a new battle? Or return to Naples and take the city back from the French and overthrow the Republican government? Why did he linger? Of course, everyone knew why. Whenever she performed a suite of her celebrated attitudes, the same repertory, the same entrancing art, which even her severest critics still judged admirable, he was there, watching raptly, his right sleeve twitching, a beguiling, beatific smile on his full lips. "By God, that is splendid," he exclaimed. "If only the greatest actresses of Europe could have been amongst us tonight, how much they could have learned from you." The guests exchanged knowing glances. She was not just impersonating Cleopatra now. She was Cleopatra, ensnaring Antony, a Dido whose charms detain Aeneas, an Armida who has bewitched Rinaldo. The familiar stories from ancient history and epic everyone knew, in which a man destined for glory makes a brief stop in the course of his great mission, succumbs to the charms of an irresistible woman, and stays, and stays, and stays. The influence of women on men has always been disparaged, feared, for its power to make men gentle, loving, weak, which means that women are thought to pose a particular danger for soldiers. A warrior's relation to women is supposed to be brutal, or at least callous, so he can go on being battle-ready, violence-primed, brother-bonded, death-resigned, so he can be strong. But this warrior really was battered and needed time to heal and be cared for. It took time to refit and repair the vanguard badly damaged by the storm, and his presence in Palermo was useful, though not well enough to go back to sea. He stayed busy drawing up plans to send a squadron under the command of Captain Trowbridge to blockade the harbor of Naples. And the Cavaliere's wife was helping him. It was his glory that she loved. Together they are moving toward a great destiny for him. And she was not a woman with a lap full of hero, but in her own way, a hero too. He wanted to please her. She wanted so desperately to please him. Ambition and the desire to please, these are not incompatible for a woman. If you please, you are rewarded. The more you please, the greater your rewards. This is why monogamy can work so well for a woman. You know whom you have to please. Now, there were two men, her husband and their friend, whom the Cavaliere's wife wanted to please. The Cavaliere's money worries were accumulating. He had been obliged to ask for several loans from their friend, confident that he could repay the money as soon as his great vase collection was sold in London, and in the meantime was discreetly selling some cameos, gems, small statues, and other lesser loves among the antiquities he had rescued from Naples. His wife had a plan. She would try to win enough money for their current expenses at the gambling table. But what started as one more dash of intervention in response to someone's distress turned into a passion, another passion. Gambling, drinking, eating, all her activities were unstinting, became cravings, and the heightened doubled desire to please further turned up the volume of her personality, her appetites. The Cavaliere knew what she was up to when she played Pharaoh and Hazard late into the night and began to count on her success, which made it grueling for him either to watch her or to ignore her. He despised anything imploring in himself. On these evenings, he usually retired early. The hero remained by her side, whispered in her ear, beamed when she felt in state to another game when she lost. How brilliantly she played, win or lose, thought the hero. No one would even have a chance against her, were it not for an endearing frailty that sometimes made her a bit muddled. He had noticed she became tipsy after the second glass of brandy. How odd, he thought. If he drank 2 glasses of brandy, he was not affected. As indifferent to drink as he was to cards, the hero was almost as abstemious as the Cavaliere. He didn't understand that the rapidity with which she became drunk was a sign not of unusual susceptibility, but of advanced alcoholism. She is a gifted player, but sometimes continues after a steady run of good fortune, risking her precious winnings so as to keep him near. For she is never so muddled as to forget his electric presence beside her, or behind her, or across a room talking, gesturing, and in fact, as aware of her as she is of him. Now that she knew how much he wants to touch him, her old freedom to touch him had become a self-conscious adventure of delicate, compensatory gestures. Pausing at the foot of the great staircase to bid goodnight to the evening's guests, she absent-mindedly touches the empty sleeve pinned to his jacket to pick off a speck of lint. She has noticed a tiny deposit of sleep in his right eye, blind eye, and wishes she could flick it away. He imagines touch without his arm when, face to face, he feels sometimes he is falling toward her. She watches his lips slightly parted when he is listening. When he speaks, she realizes sometimes that she has not heard a word of what he said. His features seem so very large. It is easier when they don't face each other, but side by side try to be interested in others. Right and left have new inflections. Right is the side on which the hero is maimed, his immobile eye, his empty sleeve. She notices that he invariably sits to her right, so as to offer his intact side. The usual alignments give rise to new, tremulous manipulations. Seated beside her at the gambling table, he becomes aware that she has been steadily scratching her left knee and wishes she would stop before she leaves a mark on her lovely skin. Her eczema has come back, as it does from time to time, but he cannot know that. Without thinking, he leans nearer to her to look at the cards in her right hand, close enough to whisper some advice about her next bid, which, as he somehow divined it would, makes the hand under the table that has been scratching stop. How mindful they are of each other's bodies inside their clothes. How mindful they are of the space that separates them. At a banquet, she becomes aware that his left thigh cannot be more than 7 inches from her right thigh. They are in the middle of the fourth course. Although he manages quite well with his elegant gold eating utensil, a hybrid device with knife-fused fork, blade facing right, tines to the left, sent him by an admirer at the Battle of the Nile, she picks up her own knife and fork, leans her upper body toward him, nearer to him, offering payment for this boldness born of intolerable yearning by moving her right leg several inches farther away from him, squeezing it against her own left leg, and being careful that her shoulder not touch his as she takes over the cutting of his meat. She is not the only person at the table this evening who has been rattled by the distance between one thing and another. M.I., one of their English guests, was holding forth on a most unusual phenomenon she had observed. Am I the only person in this gathering who has seen a little island of a picturesque form opposite the city, not much more distant than our beautiful Capri is from Naples? An island? But there is no island visible from Palermo, said another guest. So everyone has assured me, Miss Knight said primly. And when did you see this island? Her cross-examiner was Lord Minto, former ambassador to Malta and one of the hero's friends who was staying with them for several weeks. It is not visible much of the time. When the sky is entirely cloudless, I cannot distinguish it. But you do see it when the day is cloudy. Not cloudy, Lord Minto, if by that you mean overcast, when there are a few light clouds on the horizon. Lady Minto laughed. Surely what you have seen is a cloud that you have mistaken for an island. No, it cannot be a cloud. And pray, why? Because it always has the same distinctive shape. The table was silent. The Cavaliere's wife hoped the hero would enter the conversation. Quite logical, said the Cavaliere. Go on, Miss Knight. I do not know if I am logical, she said, but I will not deny the evidence of my senses. Right, said the Cavaliere. Do go on. I dare say I am very persistent, she continued, and then seemed to falter as if unsure whether she had described the trait she so admired in herself in an attractive or an unattractive way. But you were seeing an island, a real island. Yes, Lord Minto, she exclaimed. Yes, I was, for after seeing it a dozen times, I sketched it and showed my drawing to some of our officers. They immediately recognized it as one of the outermost Lipari Islands, which lies... Volcano, interrupted the Cavaliere. I do not think that was the name. Stromboli? No, I think not. You can see as far as the Lipari? Squealed the Cavaliere's wife. Oh, I wish I could see that far. A toast to Miss Knight's stubbornness, said the hero, a woman of character, and character is what I most admire in a woman. Miss Knight flushed so deep a red at this compliment from the hero that the Cavaliere's wife was moved to reach across the table and pat her hand. A relay of feeling in which a compliment inspired by her, but addressed to another, brought her a chance to make substitute contact with the hero's hand. It is quite impossible to see the Lipari Islands from here, declared Lord Minto. Since Miss Knight, after being alternately attacked and flattered by the most important men at the table, seemed adrift in feminine feelings of the self-silencing kind, the Cavaliere took the opportunity to volunteer an account of the scientific bases of mirages and other optical abnormalities. He had been reading a book about them. I think we must allow Miss Knight's claim to have seen an island, he said, his voice gleaming with authority. Would not Lord Minto himself say that he has seen his own face? I mean, of course, with the aid of a mirror. So, Miss Knight has seen a faraway island on motionless water in the Bay of Palermo, the reflection of the island, projected in the same way a camera lucida delivers the image of an object on a plane surface, but using clouds when at a certain angle instead of the camera lucida's 3 or 4-sided prism. Many artists of my acquaintance find this ingenious apparatus quite useful for making their drawings. The Cavaliere's wife pointed out to the company that her husband was an expert on every scientific question. No one, she said firmly, knows more than him. I cannot wait until the next day with light clouds to see Miss Knight's ghostly island, said Mr. McKinnon, a banker. Perhaps if the clouds are lying right, we shall see our Naples. Oh, I would not want to see our Naples now, said old Miss Ellis, who had lived there for 30 years. Perhaps the Cavaliere will be able to see Vesuvius, said the hero gaily. I'm sure he misses his volcano. The Cavaliere's wife was thinking, it is not true that she would like to see far. Everything she wants to see is right here. How can not one, but 2 fascinating men dote on her, both be so blind to her vulgarity, the shameless way she flatters them? The hero seemed ever more besotted, the Cavaliere more withered and passive, she more hectic and eager to exhibit herself. In their former life in Naples, the wife of the British ambassador would not have considered adding a dance, much less a folkloric dance of erotic abandon, to her edifying repertoire of living statues. She dances the tarantella now before their guests in Palermo. To their Sicilian acquaintances, her tambourine shaking and foot stamping and whirling about seemed nothing worse than odd or Neapolitan. But their British guests, the refugees from Naples and others who came to stay with them, such as Lord Minto on his way back to England and Lord Elgin going out to take up his post as ambassador to Turkey, were appalled and found her manner increasingly coarse and vulgar. Her dress too ostentatious, her laugh even louder, her chatter more relentless. Indeed, she was incapable of the withholding that people think of as elegance. Not only was she by nature garrulous, she thought she was always supposed to say something, and the art of understatement was as alien to her as the art of hoarding feelings. She was constantly preening herself or flattering her husband and their friend. Of course, the hero flattered her just as outrageously. The finest actress of the century, the greatest singer in Europe, the cleverest of women, and the most selfless, a paragon. But however matched they were in the throw of their effusions, it was she, being a woman, who was judged more harshly. She, they assumed, who had seduced him, her unremitting flattery that had won his heart and made him her slave. Were she still the most celebrated beauty of the era, as she had been a decade earlier, the hero's pitiable infatuation would have seemed all too understandable. But to be at the foot of this... I'm sorry, could we stop? I'm very aware that you are continuing a photograph, and I think the audience is too. Okay? Were she still the most celebrated beauty of the era, as she had been a decade earlier, the hero's pitiable infatuation would have seemed all too understandable. But to be at the foot of this, Her demerits mounted, but for nothing was she judged more harshly than her failure at what is deemed a woman's greatest, most feminine accomplishment, the maintenance and proper care of a no longer youthful body. Visitors from abroad reported that the Cavaliere's wife was continuing to put on weight. Most said she had entirely lost her looks. A few allowed that she still had a beautiful head. Though it was still several decades before the Romantics inaugurated the modern cult of thinness, which was eventually to make everyone, men as well as women, feel guilty about not being thin. Even then, when it was uncommon for someone well-born to be thin, she was not to be pardoned for becoming fat. Odd that people judged vulgar are invariably presumed also to be lacking in self-awareness, with the implication that if only they knew how they looked or behaved, they would immediately cut it out, upgrade their diction, become reticent and subtle, go on a diet. This may be the kindest form that snobbery can take, but no less obtuse for being kind. Try talking a good-natured, self-confident adult of plebeian origin out of a rich array of mannerisms called vulgar. Try it, and see how successful you will be. The Cavaliere has tried and long ago stopped trying or minding. He loved her. So it was assumed she was unaware of the change in her body. But the seams of her favorite clothes need to be let out every few months, an activity that now occupies a good deal of the energies of her dear mother, assisted by Fatima. How could she not know it? And if she overdresses now, it was precisely to say, don't look at me, look at my satin gowns, my rings, my tasseled sash, my hat with the ostrich plumes, a strategy of self-effacement not unlike that of the collector, but considerably less effective. Her detractors looked at both. No letter back to England failed to make some cruel comment on her appearance. Impossible to describe how awful she looks. Her person is nothing short of monstrous in its enormity and is growing every day, wrote Lord Minto. I had been led to expect someone of undeniable physical charms, wrote Lady Elgin, but alas, no, she is indeed a whopper. The reports about the loss of her beauty were as extravagant, as hyperbolic, as the reports of her beauty had once been. It was as if people had been made to praise her and overlook her low birth and disreputable past because she was so beautiful. Only because she was so beautiful. But now that she was no longer the epitome of beauty, all the suppressed judgments, the snobbery, and the cruelty re-emerged. The spell was broken, and everyone joined in an extraordinary chorus of scorn and spitefulness. One spring day, the Cavaliere announced that he had arranged an excursion to a villa belonging to the prince whose palace in town they were occupying. It lay on the plain east of Palermo, where many other noble families had been building country houses throughout the century. Out of consideration for the hero's defunct eye, which was hypersensitive to light, they were going out in the afternoon when the sun would be behind them. The Cavaliere's wife kept changing her place in the carriage to get a better view of the lush orange and lemon groves. Both men sat quietly, the hero toying with his eye shield and relishing the feeling of being taken care of. The Cavaliere anticipating the pleasure of sharing what he had gleaned from several descriptions of the villa in books by British travelers to Sicily. But he knew he must not say too much now, which would spoil the surprise in store for his companions when they reached their destination. And what a surprise it would be. No eccentric like a southern eccentric. Even the astonishing cathedral-like country retreat that the Cavaliere's rich cousin, William, was building back in England could not rival in insolence the villa built by the Sicilian prince's late half-brother. The large two-storied edifice of flesh pink and white stone, which the trio saw from the carriage at a distance, gave no inkling of the residence's singular contents. Its singularity was announced only when they reached the gates, which were guarded by two squatting, neckless, seven-eyed monsters, and saw before them a broad avenue lined on both sides with pedestals bearing more grotesque beings. Oh, look! Time for the Cavaliere to begin his commentary. To his wife, he directed the information that Goethe had seen the villa 12 years ago when he left Naples to go to Sicily, a year before the death of the prince who was responsible for the statues they were passing. There are more. And he took some pleasure in observing that the great poet's reaction had been quite conventional. He had thought the villa dreadful and presumed its owner to be mad. "What was that?" exclaimed the Cavaliere's wife. They were driving rapidly past the horse with human hands, the Bactrian camel with two women's heads for humps, the goose with a horse's head, the man whose face sprouted an elephant's trunk and whose hands were vulture's claws. "Some of the late prince's guardian spirits," said the Cavaliere. "And that being a man with a cow's head riding a wild calf with a man's head." "Let's stop the carriage," said the hero. "We shall see much more than this," said the Cavaliere. He pointed to the orchestra of monkeys with drums, flutes, and violins looking out at them from the edge of the villa's roof. "Let us continue." Lackeys were waiting to help them from the carriage, and a podgy man in black livery, the chamberlain, stood at the threshold of the great entrance to greet them. "I never before saw black livery," whispered the hero. "Perhaps he still wears mourning for his master," said the Cavaliere's wife. The Cavaliere smiled. "I should not be surprised, my dear, if you were right." Outside the entrance door, warped, splintered, a dwarf with the laurel-crowned head of a Roman emperor sat astride a dolphin. The Cavaliere's wife patted the dwarf's head. "There is more inside," said the Cavaliere, "though the villa is already much despoiled." They followed the chamberlain up a rather filthy staircase and into the first floor above ground level, through halls and anterooms, past more composite creatures and odd couples. "Oh, look! A double-headed peacock riding an angel on all fours. Lordy! A mermaid with a dog's paw, coupling with a stag. And look at this!" The Cavaliere's wife had stopped before two seated, sumptuously garbed figures playing cards, one a lady with a horse's head, the other a gentleman with a griffin's head, dressed in a full-bottomed wig and crown. "I should like to have a horse's head for a day," she exclaimed, and see what it would feel like. "Oh," said the hero, "I'm sure you would be a most beautiful horse." "I should like to see the faces of our guests when you sat down and played Pharaoh with such a head on your shoulders," said the Cavaliere. "No doubt you would win every game." The Cavaliere's wife gave a robust imitation of a horse's neigh, and both men broke into laughter. The Cavaliere was ready to join in the mockery of the late prince's affectations to be at one with his wife and their friend, but he wanted to make sure that their amusement was as saturated with knowledge as his own. Wherever he was, the Cavaliere was prone to cast himself in the role of the guide or mentor. At a funeral, he would have lectured a fellow mourner on the history of cemetery monuments. What a deft antidote to anxiety or grief one's own erudition can be. Stimulated by the prince's penchant for horses with limbs, or the head of some other creature, and humans with horses' heads, the Cavaliere began to recount the stories of Chiron, Pegasus, and other horses in ancient mythology with extra parts. He thought it worth pointing out that these mutants were always semi-divine creatures. Recall Achilles' wise tutor, who was half horse, half human, or the hippogriff, whose father was a griffin and whose mother was a filly, and in Ariosto is a symbol of love. Love. The Cavaliere's wife heard the word resound in the sepulchral silence of the villa. She had not pronounced it. nor their friend. The Cavaliere is not really thinking about love, but the word seems as good a talisman as any against the unsettling violence of feeling expressed in the grotesque inventions with which the prince had populated the villa and its grounds. Their friend was dodging the thought of love too, and ventured a small contribution of his own to the learned discussion. In Egypt, said the victor of the Battle of the Nile, I was told of an immense statue that is a creature with the head and bosom of a woman and the lower limbs of a lion. She must be an awesome sight crouching in the sand. Oh, yes, I read about that. She waits for passing travelers and she makes them halt, and then she kills them, except those that can solve a riddle, them she spares. That's another cruel creature, my dear, said the Cavaliere gently, but I would not be surprised if we were to come across either your Sphinx or the Egyptian one, or something resembling, here in these very rooms, among the prince's stone companions. Shall we look for her? And we'll think of a riddle to ask her, cried the Cavaliere's wife. They passed into another drawing room, calling out to one another as they came across more tableaux of the deformed and ill-coupled, the chamberlain trailing behind a silent reproach to their gaiety and their wish to condescend to what they were seeing. The human imagination has always been entertained by the fantasy of biological misalliances and by the reality of bodies that don't look as bodies are supposed to look, which can endure ordeals bodies are not supposed to be able to endure. Painters loved to invent such creatures when they had the pretext. Circuses and fairs display them, freaks, mutants, odd couples, animals doing stunts that violate their nature. The Cavaliere may not have been familiar with Bosch and Bruegel on the subject of hell or the torments of St. Anthony, but he had seen somewhat less inspired depictions of those anatomical assemblages called demons or monsters. Were it only a question of these freakish beings in every corner, the contents of the prince's lair would not have been so original. Even more astonishing was the profusion of whimsical, threatening, no, freakish objects. Lamps in the shape of a human or animal limb. Tables constructed of shards of tile and made too tall to be of use. Columns and pyramids, at least 40 of them, made of different kinds of china and pottery. One column has a chamber pot for its plinth, a circle of little flower pots for its capital, and a 4-foot-long shaft composed entirely of teapots that diminish gradually in size from plinth to capital. Chandeliers, whose many-tiered components suspended like drop earrings, with bottoms, necks, and handles of broken bottles and barometers. Candelabra more than 3 feet high, jerry-built out of pieces of caudle cups, saucers, bowls, jugs, kettles, and tilting ominously. Examining one of the candelabra more closely, the Cavaliere saw to his surprise that among the shards of humble crockery stuck together at random were segments of exceptionally fine porcelain. Vases, each of which disgorges a mutant creature or a scroll from its belly or base. The Cavaliere was starting to feel queasy, finally, as the impression of the grotesque was replaced by the impression of an immense sarcasm. He had been prepared for the grotesque. He had not been prepared for the recognition that the prince's temperament was a demented variant of the collector's, though what this fellow collector had amassed were not objects found or purchased, but made according to his designs. To piece together fragments of costly porcelain and chunks of kitchenware, was this not merely a mocking echo of the democracy of objects found in many aristocratic collections, such as the Duchess of Portland's, which displayed exquisite paintings alongside branches of coral and seashells? Like any collector, the prince had surrounded himself with things for people to pay attention to. marvel at when they visited him. They defined him. He was, above all, the proprietor of these objects which spoke for him, which announced the way he saw the world. They did not say what the Cavalieri, like all great collectors, wished to say with objects. Look at all the beauty and interest there is in the world. They said, the world is mad. Ordinary life is ridiculous if you take some distance from it. Anything can turn into anything else. Anything can be dangerous. Anything can collapse, give way. An ordinary object can be made from anything. Any shape can be deformed. Any common purpose served by objects balked. How many of them there were? As the trio followed the Chamberlain through room after room, their ability to respond to what they were seeing began to buckle under the emotional weight, the sheer profusion of assertive objects. Like any obsessed collector, the prince could not get enough of what he coveted. Like a collector, he lived in a crowded space. The objects accumulated, multiplied. And the prince had devised a way to make them multiply further. They had been brought into the great salon, one of the many rooms whose ceiling, walls, doors, even locks, were covered with mirrors. "Where are the monsters?" said the Cavalieri's wife. "There's no monsters here." The Cavalieri explained that some of the late prince's more fanciful creations had already been taken away and destroyed by his half-brother, the present head of the family, who did not enjoy the villa's continuing notoriety. Servants were bringing in tea and setting it on a great sideboard with panels made from hundreds of sawn-off pieces of antique gilt frames in different styles of carving. The black-garbed chamberlain had become more animated since they had entered the room. "Ah, if you could have seen the villa in the days when my late master was alive," the chamberlain broke out. "The chandeliers ablaze, the room full of His Highness's friends dancing and enjoying themselves." "Did the prince give balls?" asked the Cavalieri sharply. "I am surprised to hear it. I should have thought a man of his tastes and temperament would have preferred seclusion." "True, Excellency," said the chamberlain. "My master preferred the villa to himself. But his wife sometimes longed for company." "His wife?" exclaimed the Cavalieri's wife. "Did he have a wife?" "Did they have children?" asked the hero, who could not help wondering if a pregnant woman confined in these surroundings would not give birth to a monster. "My master lacked nothing that makes a man happy," said the chamberlain. One would hardly suppose that, thought the Cavalieri, who had begun to examine the room. "May I humbly suggest," said the chamberlain, "that their excellencies not sit. He was pointing. There. Oh. Indeed, one would have little incentive to do so, not on chairs with legs of different lengths, ensuring that no one could sit on them. Nor there," observed the hero, waving his arm at some normally constructed chairs grouped with their backs to one another. Most unfriendly, wouldn't you agree? "Nor there," continued the chamberlain solemnly, indicating 3 handsome, ornate chairs arranged in the proper way so that those conversing could face one another. "Why not?" hooted the Cavalieri's wife, rolling her eyes at her husband in the familiar language of marital complicity. "If her ladyship will touch one of the chairs." She went toward it. "Carefully, my lady." She ran her beringed hand over the velvet cushioned seat and burst out laughing. "What is it?" said the hero. "There's a spike under the cushion." "Perhaps," said the Cavalieri, "we will forego tea and venture out into the park. It is a fine day." "So my master would have wished it," said the chamberlain. The Cavalieri, displeased with the chamberlain's tone, which since their arrival had seemed to him slightly impertinent, turned with a reproving stare to make the gesture that dismissed him, one of the rare occasions for looking closely at a servant's face, and only then observed that the man had a steely blue eye and a lustrous brown one, rhyming, as it were, with the hybrid objects the late prince had designed. The Cavalieri's wife trained by years of womanly solicitude to read every shift of her husband's attention, instantly saw what the Cavaliere was noticing. As the chamberlain bowed gravely and backed toward a door, she murmured something to the hero, who smiled, waited until the chamberlain had left, and then said he would be happy to have a brown and a blue eye if he could see with both of them. The Cavaliere's wife exclaimed how handsome he would be with eyes of different color. "Shall we go out?" said the Cavaliere. "Forgive me if I do not join you both for a while," said the hero, who was looking a little wan. He was tired. He was often tired. It seemed an exertion even to have to put the shield back on his poor eye to protect it from the roasting effulgence of Sicilian sun. "Please remain with our friend," said the Cavaliere to his wife. "I shall enjoy looking by myself." Before leaving them, however, he could not resist providing one more observation to make sure that they fully appreciated the originality of the room in which they stood. Looking up at the irregular panes of smoky mirror on the ceiling, he explained that the prevalence of mirrors is what he regarded as most novel in the prince's conception. "I myself had once thought," he said, then paused, recalling with vexation the mirrored wall and lost vistas of his observatory room in Naples. "And note," he continued, stifling the pang, "note how skillfully it is done, taking sheets of mirror and breaking them into a multitude of little mirrors, each a different size, then ingeniously fitting them together creates effects that are undoubtedly bizarre. Since each of them makes a small angle with the other, the effect is like that of a multiplying glass, so that the three of us walking below make 300 of us walking above. But I find this abundance of effects preferable to the monotony that would result from covering so vast a room with unbroken expanses of glass." The Cavaliere's wife and the hero were listening attentively, respectfully. They are both genuinely interested in what the Cavaliere had to say. At the same time, they see each other, they spy on each other while the Cavaliere goes on talking. A room with mirrors is a fearful temptation. Even more so, a room with a canopy of broken mirrors, as faceted as a fly's eye, in which they see themselves multiplied, superimposed, deformed. But deformities created by mirrors only make them laugh. And when the Cavaliere went off to look at some other rooms and tour the park, and they realized it is just the two of them now, when father has gone and the children are left alone in the funhouse, they stand there in silence, the fat lady and the short man with one arm, and try to look only at the mirrors. But a gust of happiness that seems to have no borders, bliss without an edge, envelops them. And exhausted by the stress of desire, hilarious with happiness, they turn toward each other and kiss, and kiss, and kiss. And their turn, their kiss, was shattered, multiplied in the mirrors above.
There will be an autographing which will be right out to my left, and there are some books for sale out there too. Again, thank you for coming, and we'll see you next year.